Russian/Soviet half-tracks of World War I, the Russian Civil War, and the Second World War. Now, when I say half-tracks, I'm only counting the armored half-tracks or the infantry support half-tracks, not the artillery tractors or the, transportation half-tracks. Only the armored combat half-tracks that were designed by the Soviet Union during World War I, the Russian Civil War, and World War II. Now, during the First World War, the Russian Civil War, and World War II, the Russians actually designed a variety of different half-track based armored fighting vehicles and armored personnel carriers. So let's go over some of these vehicles. Now, first, we're going to start with World War I. Now, during World War I, Russia was known as the Russian Empire, and it was led by the Tsar. Now, during the First World War, Russia only developed like 2 or 3 prototype tanks, and the Russians largely relied on armored cars and armored trucks, with half of the armored cars in Russia being produced in other countries, for example, Britain, France, or the United States. But during World War I, the Russians became one of the first countries to adopt the half-track or the armored half-track. These were half-tracks that were designed to be infantry support vehicles. And the first half-track used by the Russian Empire was the Golkivka in 1917. This was a armored half-track that was designed in 1917 and early 1917. It was designed during a time where Russia was already on the verge of civil war, but it was used on the Eastern Front against the Germans and Austro-Hungarian Empire. The vehicle was armed with one 7.62mm PM 1910 Maxim machine gun. It had an armor thickness of between 6 and 12 millimeters. Its speed was 72 kilometers per hour or 45 miles per hour. It had a crew of 27. It had a crew of It had a crew of 3 plus 7 troops. So this armored half-track also doubled as it's kind of a infantry armored personnel carrier that was used by the Imperial Russian forces. This vehicle was later used during the Russian Civil War. Now, it's actually unknown how many of these vehicles were produced, but if I had to estimate, it was probably no more than 3 to 5. Keep in mind, during World War I, the Russians rarely mass-produced their armored fighting vehicles in bulk. They usually only produced about 5 to maybe 30 of any model of their vehicle. And when it came to vehicles like half-tracks, the Russians usually didn't produce no more than 12. Russians usually didn't produce no more than 12 of these armored infantry fighting half-tracks. Now, later on in 1917, the Russians came up with another version of the Golkivka. This was the second version, and this was a more primitive version. The second version was also introduced in later 1917 during the early stages of the Russian Civil War. Now, this secondary version was armed with a 76.2mm short gun and a rear turret, plus 2 7.62mm PM 1910 Maxim machine guns. This vehicle had an armor thickness of only 6.5 millimeters and a speed of 12 kilometers per hour or 9.3 miles per hour. And it had a crew of between 2 and 6. Now, this vehicle was designed by the White Russian forces during the early stages of the Russian Civil War, but it was later captured by the Red Army. And what happened to it during the Russian Civil War is really unknown, as this vehicle wasn't well documented. Only its construction and its eventual capture was documented as taking place between 1917 and 1918. After 1918, this vehicle pretty much disappeared from the map, but it is one of the more advanced armored half-tracks designed during World War I and the early stages of the Russian Civil War. In fact, this vehicle was the first half-track to be fitted with an artillery piece instead of just a machine gun. Now, most half-tracks designed during World War I and most armored vehicles as a whole, with the exception of tanks, were fitted with machine guns, yet this half-track was fitted with a turret mounting a 76.2 millimeter short gun or short howitzer. The gun, it was actually a M1902 Pavlov model 76.2 millimeter howitzer that was being used by the Russian army, the Imperial Russian Army, and later the Soviet Army during the Russian Civil War. Now, later on in 1918, when the Russian Civil War became, a full-blown conflict, the Russian automobile designer Austin. Now, the next vehicle on the list is the Austin Kigras. The Austin Kigras was a armored infantry support half-track designed originally in 1918. Now, Austin Kigras was the Russian branch of the Austin automobile manufacturing plant, or automobile manufacturing company. Now, Austin was actually based in the UK, but during World War I, the British actually sent some of their plants to Russia in order to provide armored fighting vehicles for the Imperial Russian Army. Now, when the Russian Civil War broke out in 1918, many of the British employees simply fled, leaving these plants behind. So what happened is one of these plants ended up producing armored half-tracks for the White Russian Army. And these armored half-tracks were known as the Austin Kigras. Now, the Austin Kigras had a main armament of two 7.62 millimeter PM 1910 Maxim machine guns. Its armor thickness was 6 to 8 millimeters, and it had a speed of 40 kilometers per hour or 24.8 miles per hour. It had a crew of 6, and only 12 of these armored half-tracks were ever constructed. And these were actually used by the White Russian forces from 1918 until 1919. Now, what happened is the Bolshevik Red Army, or the Soviet Army under Lenin, eventually captured most of these vehicles. Some of these vehicles ended up in Poland also. The Polish army captured at least 2 or 3 of these Austin Kigras half-tracks from either directly from the Bolshevik Red Army, or they were handed over to the Poles by the White Russian Army. And they were later used in the Polish-Soviet War against their original owners, the Russians. Now, the Russians continued using the Austin Kigras into the 1920s and 30s, and there are some sources that stated that at least one of these vehicles was still in service, or at least, it was refurbished during the early stages of World War II. But that is just a rumor. For the most part, these vehicles went out of service between 1930 and 1935. But the Austin Kigras was pretty much one of the more advanced armored half-tracks designed by the Russians during the early stages of the Russian Civil War and during the Polish-Soviet War. Which brings us to the next half-track designed during the Russian Civil War, and that is the Bullock's Lombard. The Bullock Lombard was a series of armored half-tracks that were also designed between 1918 and 1919. Now, these vehicles were designed by the White Russian Army again, and these vehicles were fitted with 3 7.62 millimeter PM 1910s. Some other sources state that only 2 machine guns, and there are other sources that state that this vehicle had 4 machine guns actually. Its armor thickness was between 6 and 12 millimeters. It had a speed of 72 kilometers per hour or 45 miles per hour, and it had a crew of 4, but it could also carry 7 troops. So this vehicle doubled as a armored half-track / armored personnel carrier. Now, the Bullock's Lombard was actually constructed by the White Russian government in 1918, and it became the second series of half-tracks after the Austin Kigras. Now, these vehicles were used against the Bolsheviks during the early stages of the war, but some of them fell into the hands of the Red Army and were used against their original owners, the White Russian forces, fighting against the Bolsheviks. Now, this vehicle, when compared to the Austin Kigras, this is one of the, secondary best vehicles designed by the Russians during the war in terms of half-tracks. I believe this vehicle is probably more reliable. One of the problems with the Austin Kigras was that it could break down real easy. Those vehicles actually did break down a lot. In fact, Poland captured 2 of those Austin Kigros because they broke down, but luckily the Poles were able to, repair those vehicles and put them back into service in the Polish army. The Bullock Lombard didn't really have that problem as it was a cheaper vehicle, It was cheaper and it had more spare parts. It was actually built from an artillery tractor or a series of artillery tractors that were already being used by the Russian military during the latter years of World War I and by the White Russian military. It is unknown how many of these Bullocks Lombards were actually constructed, but I would estimate no more than maybe 5 to 10 maximum. These vehicles were also used during the Polish-Soviet War between 1919 and 1921. And these vehicles pretty much disappeared sometime in the late 20s. I don't see any records of the Bullocks Lombard past the year 1922/1924. So these vehicles were probably decommissioned and scrapped because they do not appear in the Second World War. Keep in mind, during World War II, a lot of these old World War I and Russian Civil War vintage vehicles were refurbished and reused by some of these civilian units within the Red Army or some of the lower ranking units within the Red Army during the Second World War, but I don't see the Bullocks Lombard anywhere in the Soviet inventory during the Second World War era, which pretty much means these vehicles were probably scrapped or destroyed during the Polish-Soviet War, or were probably just decommissioned or destroyed again during the Russian Civil War, because the Russian Civil War didn't end until 1923. So these vehicles basically disappeared in the 1920s, and that basically ends the information on the Bullocks Lombard. Another half-track designed by the Soviets was designed by the end, at the very end of the Russian Civil War. And this was in 1923, and this was the Kerensky-Petersburg model of half-track. And only a handful of these were produced, only like 2 to 4 maximum. And these vehicles were improvised armored half-tracks or cheaply made armored half-tracks from 1923. These vehicles had one 7.62 millimeter PM M1910 Maxim machine gun. The armor thickness was again between 6 and 12 millimeters. It had a speed of 27 kilometers per hour, and it had a crew of 3 plus 7. It could carry 7 troops in the rear area. Now, this vehicle is very similar to the first half-track I showed you on the list, and it's basically a simplified version, or at least it was probably inspired by it. This vehicle is really, really rare. I can't find much information on it. All I know is that it was produced by the Red Army. So I guess this is one of the first Red Army made half-tracks designed towards the very, very end of the Russian Civil War during the last year of the Civil War in Russia in 1923. Again, just like the Bullocks Lombard, this vehicle does not reappear after the Russian Civil War. I don't see it in the list of vehicles, of antiquated vehicles that were used by the Soviet Union during the Second World War, which leads me to believe that the vehicle was probably scrapped sometime after the Civil War, maybe in the late 1920s or probably in the 30s, like a lot of these older vehicles. And that's basically it. There's not much on the Kerensky-Petersburg half-track, other than the fact that it was produced by the Soviet Red Army in limited numbers. Now, during the interwar years, the Soviet Union actually experimented with mass-producing half-tracks, or at least with the idea of making half-tracks a standard within the Soviet Red Army. Now, during the Russian Civil War and World War I, half-tracks were pretty rare. In all, less than 20 half-tracks were produced by the Russians during World War I and the Russian Civil War, or only about 20 were produced. Only about 20 half-tracks were produced during those two conflicts. But the Soviet Union in the 1930s had been manufacturing armored cars like crazy. They had hundreds and hundreds of armored cars, probably at least 1,000 armored cars by the eve of World War II. But in 1939, the Soviets designed the first post-Russian Civil War half-track that was meant to be a standard within the Soviet Army. And that half-track is the B-9 light machine gun. The DT-29 was to become the standard tank machine gun or vehicle machine gun used in Soviet tanks and armored cars. But the BA-30 was one of the first vehicles to be fitted with the DT-20. Its armor thickness was only 2.5 to 9 millimeters, and it had a speed of 37 kilometers or 22.9 miles per hour. This vehicle had a crew of 3, and it is literally one of the rarest half-tracks that was designed by the Soviet Union towards almost the beginning of World War II. Now, this vehicle was actually tested in 1939, between 1939 and 1940, during the early years of the war, during the invasion of Poland. It wasn't used in Poland, keep in mind. It was just tested in Russia during the same time as those battles in Europe, for example, Poland, Belgium, and France, and Greece and Yugoslavia. It was tested during the same time period that those battles were taking place, but the Soviets realized that this vehicle wasn't very useful. For example, it only had one 7mm machine gun. The Soviets were looking for something more heavy, a more heavy duty weapon. By World War II, many armored cars within the Soviet military were now mounting 37 and 45mm guns as their main armament, and machine guns weren't really needed on these vehicles. The Russians were looking for something better than a light armored half-track. So the BA-30 project was pretty much canceled by the time that Germany invaded the Soviet Union in February 1941, Operation Barbarossa. And so that pretty much ends the history on the BA-30. It's one of the rarer Soviet half-tracks that were designed in the 1930s and tested in the early 40s, but ultimately it was never mass-produced, and the vehicle pretty much disappeared past 1941. In 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. This was Operation Barbarossa, and now the Russians were racing to develop weapons in order to stop the Axis blitzkrieg against the Soviet Red Army. So in 1941, one of the early vehicles that was proposed for the Soviet Red Army was an armored self-propelled anti-tank half-track from 1941, and this vehicle was known as the ZIS-41 or ZIS-41. The ZIS-41 was a limited production armored self-propelled anti-tank half-track from 1941. This vehicle's main armament was one 57mm ZIS-2 anti-tank gun. Its armor thickness was 10 millimeters, and it had a speed of 30 kilometers per hour or 18.6 miles per hour. Crew was 6, and it is one of the lesser known half-tracks used by the Soviet Red Army. Now keep in mind, this weapon system was very rare. Now in 1941, one of the main problems the Russians had was that most of their tanks, with the exception of the KV-1 and early model T-34 tanks, were pretty outdated. For example, the BT-5, the BT-7, the T-26, and basically all of the light tanks were pretty much useless against the German Panzer IVs, the Panzer IIIs, and the Tiger tanks that were being used against the Russian army during the German blitzkrieg, the German-led blitzkrieg on the Eastern Front. So the Soviets needed self-propelled anti-tank guns, and this ZIS-41 was one of the first self-propelled anti-tank guns, but the Soviets only produced a small number. It was a limited production prototype vehicle at best, and it basically disappeared after a while. The vehicle was mass-produced in a slightly different version, a less armored version known as the ZIS-43 or ZIS-42/ZIS-43, and it was basically the same vehicle. I mean, there wasn't much difference. It's the 57mm gun on this bad boy could punch through upwards to 50 to 60 millimeters of armor at 500 to 600 yards, and that was basically enough to destroy any Panzer III or IV, but against a Tiger tank, it was still pretty useless. So Panzer Is through IVs could easily be knocked out. A Panther tank could be defeated if the crew managed to get within like 200 yards of a Panther, but the ZIS-41 was basically one of the rarer Soviet anti-tank half-tracks used during World War II. Now, during World War II, the Soviets also needed more self-propelled anti-aircraft guns, and one of the self-propelled anti-aircraft guns designed by the Soviet Union was the ZIS-43. This was another limited production half-track vehicle. This was another rare limited production improvised or limited production armored self-propelled anti-aircraft half-track from 1942. This weapon's main armament was one 37mm K61 M1939 anti-aircraft autocannon, a single-barreled version. This vehicle's armor thickness was only 10mm, and this vehicle had a speed of 35 kilometers per hour or 21.7 miles per hour. This was one of the rarer self-propelled anti-aircraft systems used by the Soviet Union. It wasn't really mass-produced all that much. Keep in mind, the Soviets were already slapping anti-aircraft weapons on the backs of flatbed pickup trucks, so a half-track was kind of pointless, but it was useful in the winter, during the Soviet winter. But the Soviets also had unarmored half-tracks that were being used as anti-aircraft platforms, and many of these unarmored half-tracks were utility vehicles that were being used or modified into cheap anti-aircraft vehicles. So it kind of made the ZIS-43 pointless, you know. But the 37mm gun could also be used as an infantry support weapon. It could be used against enemy snipers or machine gun emplacements. And the vehicle was armored enough that it could withstand rifle caliber cartridges from rifles and machine guns. So it was still a good vehicle, but it was not really all that needed, and that's why the Russians didn't produce that many of them. Now, later on, the Russians did propose a heavier version. Later on, the Russians did propose a half-track version of their BA-6 armored car, and the design was originally published in 1934. And it was also submitted during World War II. And this half-track version of the BA-6 was known as the AD-6C Kigros Snowmobile. And this was basically a light armored car or half-track armored car that was meant to be produced in 1934, but it was resubmitted during World War II. But ultimately, the Russians didn't like this design. But this weapon would have had one 45mm 20K main gun. Its armor thickness was still 2.5 to 9mm, and its speed was 37 kilometers per hour or 22.9 miles per hour, and it had a crew of 3. Now, the AD-6C Kigros was never produced. It was just a proposed modification of the existing Soviet BA-6 armored car. The next half-track on the list is the TB-42. Now, this was a armored personnel carrier half-track designed in 1944. Now, by 1944, the Russians were preparing for the eventual invasion of Germany itself. They were looking for more armored personnel carriers in order to lower the number of casualties being suffered by the Red Army. Keep in mind, the Red Army was still largely using unarmored flatbed trucks to transport their troops, but you also had many troops that were just marching on foot or riding on horseback or riding on mules, and they were pretty much exposed to German snipers, machine gunners, and also landmines. So this TB-42 was a potential half-track armored personnel carrier that was meant to be produced in 1944, but its ultimate goal was to lower the amount of casualties being caused by the German army as the Germans were retreating. But the TB-42 was never produced. Its main armament was one 7.62mm DT-29 or RP-39 light machine gun. Its armor thickness is pretty much unknown, but I would assume that it was probably no different than the ZIS-43. Its armor thickness probably would have been somewhere around 10 to 15 millimeters. Its speed was 25 kilometers per hour or 15.5 miles per hour, and it had a crew of 2, but it could carry upwards transports to 14 troops. The TB-42 is one of the rare prototypes. Only one prototype was ever produced, and the TB-42 was simply abandoned. But they continued to design half-tracks, and the final half-track designed by the Soviet Union in World War II was the B-3 half-track from 1944. The B-3 was a prototype armored personnel carrier from 1944. Its main armament was one 12.7 millimeter DSHK heavy machine gun. Its armor thickness was 6 to 15 millimeters. Its speed was 40 kilometers per hour or 24.8 miles per hour. And it had a crew of 3, plus it could carry 12 troops. It had two crewmen plus one machine gunner, plus it could carry 12 troops. Now this was pretty much a heavier armored personnel carrier half-track that was designed for the Soviet Red Army, and it was pretty much designed around the same time as the TB-42, or at the same time as the TB-42. And just like the TB-42, the Soviets eventually rejected the prototype as a whole, but it was one of the better half-tracks. I mean, this was basically like a heavy version of the American M2 or M3 half-track. You know, the Americans had the M2 and M3 half-tracks, and they too were armed with 50 caliber machine guns. So this is basically like the Soviet version of those vehicles. Keep in mind, the Soviet Union actually did use M2 and M3 half-tracks that were provided by the United States via the Lend-Lease program. So that was probably one of the other reasons why the Soviets abandoned both the B-3 and the TB-42. They were already getting half-tracks from the US, and the Soviet Union also began producing cheap copies of those American half-tracks produced by the Gaz company. Gaz, G-A-Z, was one of the main providers of infantry support vehicles for the Soviet Red Army since the 1920s and 30s. So in World War II, they were still producing vehicles. So by the time 1944 came around, these vehicles, the B-3 and the TB-42, were pretty much, they were good designs, but they just weren't really needed because the Soviet Union kind of already had what they needed via the American Lend-Lease program and their ability to copy foreign weapons that they either purchased themselves or got for free via the Lend-Lease programs. And that was basically it for the Russian half-tracks of World War I, the Russian Civil War, and World War II. Which one of these half-tracks did you like the most? My favorite was the ZIS-41, just because it looks like a formidable weapon. Also like the Bullock's Lombard as well, because it looks like something I would design if I were a Russian arms designer living in Russia during the early stages of the Russian Civil War. So what do you all think of these vehicles? Please tell me in the comment section below. And until next time, this was J-Man Time, signing off.